We call it Memorial Day. Our dictionary tells us that memorial means something that keeps remembrance alive. Today we remember, and there is much to remember for each generation. Certain events in our nation's history are burned in our collective consciousness. All of us know where we were on the day of 11th of September 2001 when terrorists destroyed the World Trade Centers and attacked the Pentagon, the very core of our military power. We remember where we were when the Berlin Wall came down, marking the end of a half-century of communism and repression. We remember where we were when we put the first man on the moon. Many of us here were here to recall when John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Texas on that cold November day in 1963. We remember where we were and what we were doing, though nearly 50 years have passed. How many days of our lives can we recall with such clarity? And finally, there are those of us here, Ray, who remember that Sunday morning on the 7th of December 1941, when a dawn attack on an unsuspecting military forces in Pearl Harbor nearly succeeded in breaking the back of the United States Navy. Instead, Imperial Japanese forces woke a sleeping giant. We remember these events, even if we did not actually participate in them, because they represent the triumphs and the tragedies of this great nation. They are branded in our souls because they are bigger than us, because they cause us to turn to our neighbor and say, we have a bond in shared anger when our nation is attacked. Sadness in the loss of our youth, triumph and achievement in the face of adversity, and pride in a nation that seems at its best when under stress. Those young men and women who served in World War II did not know that greatness and hardship would be their lot. The period before World War II was a time of optimism. They'd survived the Great Depression. The world was changing. The economy was improving. Life, while not easy, was filled with promise. Yes, there was war in Europe, along with the threat of Japanese imperialism in Asia, but these were distant lands. The United States was protected by a mighty navy and broad oceans. It was a nation with other priorities. It was a lusty, exuberant, confident time. That was the America of the 6th of December, 1941. That all changed on that Sunday morning, and the young people of the time changed with it. They put aside their personal hopes and their aspirations. They left farms, they left schools and families and went en masse to the recruiting stations. They put on uniforms and they picked up weapons and they rolled back the forces of evil. They made up what Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation. This generation put their lives on hold. They did what needed to be done in the name of freedom. They gave up their hopes, their loves, their families, and in many cases their lives to support their nation. Many didn't come back home. Others came home broken in health. They didn't complain, they didn't indulge in self-pity, or look for someone else to do the job. They did it, and some of you are here today. We are fortunate you are with us. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your inspiration. Thank you for your spirit and your example. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to hear a round of applause to salute the greatest generation, those who served in World War II. And lest we forget that other war that came so soon after and has often been called the Forgotten War, Korea. The veterans of World War II in Korea went back to work. They built a thriving economy. They raised children. They sent their kids to school, and they worked hard to give them more than they had themselves. They were filled with sadness as America went to Asia for a third time, and in their lives to a place called Vietnam, a place where the reasons for war were not so clear-cut, and their children also fought and died, and those who came home didn't see any victory parades. They lived through the 60s not quite understanding it or the changes that were taking place in their country. They watched the United States rebuild its military and regain its spirit in the 80s. My father's generation no longer went to war, but saw that their children and grandchildren had that same fighting spirit. They saw us respond to the forces of tyranny as we ousted a dictator in Panama and returned Kuwait to its own people during Operation Desert Storm. Our veterans watched with sadness as America was once again attacked on its own soil. Now, instead of receiving the news in newspapers and on radio, technology brought the horror of the 11th of September in our own living rooms as it was happening. 4 generations of America watched innocent people being flown into buildings, snuffing out thousands of lives in an instant. They watched the Pentagon, the symbol of American military might, spewing smoke and flames from a great gash in its side. America was wounded, but not broken, and once again the sleeping giant awoke. We took the fight to the enemy where we found them. We went to the ends of the earth, to a place called Afghanistan, where Al-Qaeda and Taliban terrorists had thought themselves safe to train for and plan their next attack in impunity. The worst of them were taken to a place called Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. 7 years before that, Guantanamo had used for another purpose, to house the Cuban and Haitian migrants who had been picked up for trying to get into this country. I was ordered to Guantanamo twice, the first time as the Joint Task Group commander of the migrant camps. The 15,000 migrants called themselves bolseros, Spanish for rafters. I was sent to lead the command that operated these migrant camps and maintain order and discipline. When the decision was made to admit them with those with clean records into the United States, I told my Marines and soldiers that worked for me, make them want to be like us. I tell you this for a reason. It's going to become clearer in a moment. In January 2003, my command received its second deployment order in 9 months. We packed up immediately for Kuwait as one of the lead elements in the subsequent invasion of Iraq. And within 30 days after the decision to deploy troops into Kuwait in preparation of Iraq, this year nearly 250,000 troops were deployed to do its nation's bidding. Soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen of Operation Iraqi Freedom surged across the border, and within a month, Saddam Hussein's government was no more. The topic of this talk is remembrance. For those of you who've been to war, you remember those who didn't come home. As a commander, I remember the first Marine I ever lost in combat. He represents for me the sacrifices that this generation has made in their defense of freedom. The Marine's name was Armando Gonzalez. He came from Hialeah, Florida, by the way of Cuba. Yes, Cuba, because I'd met Corporal Gonzalez before. In 1995, at the age of 14, Armando Gonzalez got into a leaky boat from Cuba, looking for a better life. He began the dangerous trip from Cuba, but was picked up by the U.S. Coast Guard and taken to a place called Guantanamo. He was one of those 15,000 bolseros who had been in those camps that I commanded in 1995. When he was granted permission to come to the United States, perhaps because he felt we had treated him well, he became a United States Marine. I didn't know he was a bolsero when I met him. I met him the day before he died. The first day I met him was 13th of April, 2003. It was nearly 200 miles into Iraq. He was driving a 5,000-gallon refueling truck, and his convoy was pulled off to the side of the road. It was so dusty, everybody was gray. White Marines were gray, black Marines were gray, and brown Marines were gray. We were all gray. I gave him a box of wet wipes and a sports section of a 3-week-old newspaper. He never mentioned where he came from. Perhaps he didn't think it was important. What he was really important that day was that he was an American fighting man doing his job and doing it well. It was the last time I saw him alive. He was killed the next day on the 14th of April. He left his wife, Ludmilla, who was 5 months pregnant with her first child. Ludmilla gave birth to a baby girl named Amanda. Amanda's never going to know her dad. I hope that someone will tell her of his pride in being a United States Marine and of his sacrifice. And I'll always remember Armando Gonzalez. Our nation remembered Armando as well when Governor Jeb Bush presented his daughter with a full scholarship to a Florida university of her choice. It was the right thing for our nation to do. For it isn't where you were born or the color of your skin that makes you an American. It's your willingness to fight for this great country, a country founded upon a radical concept that all people are created equal. Even if you're not, sometimes we have not always lived up to those ideals, we strive to become better citizens in a land where people are willing to risk their lives to be part of an idea that is bigger than ourselves and that recognizes we can create a better society than the one we came from. It's America's lot to send some of each generation to war. The defense of freedoms requires those who are willing to fight and die for it. Our citizenry can never take those veterans for granted, for if we do, our nation will begin that slow slide toward mediocrity and complacency. Each generation must have those who are willing to go into harm's way in the service of their country. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for letting me speak to you today. Thank you for your service. Thank you for standing the watch in the defense of what we believe in. And thank you for remembering.